Hi, I'm Marina Koker. I'm Russian language and culture instructor, Russian grammar expert, Russian oral proficiency interview tester, curriculum and course designer, textbook author, and the founder of Russian Mobile Academy. I have a 30 plus years of experience in teaching Russian to adults in universities, in Russia, in the US, and in Latvia, for the US government and private language schools. Since 2015, I design and teach online Russian language courses at my Russian Mobile Academy. I have a PhD from Vinogradov Institute of Russian Language at the Russian Academy of Sciences, and I love explaining grammar concepts in a simple, actionable, and visual way. Today, we'll talk about Russian verbs of motion, and specifically about two questions. What are verbs of motion and what's so hard about them? What are verbs of motion? It's a special group of Russian verbs. They're used to describe the movement from one place to another. But not all Russian verbs that describe movement belong to this group. For example, running is a verb of motion, but jumping is not. Swimming is a verb of motion, but diving is not. Verbs of motions are the most used verbs in Russian language, so it's important to learn them. And they're the hardest to master, so you have a problem here. What makes verbs of motion so hard to master? There are 4 reasons for that. Let's start with the first one. Verbs of motion are different from all other Russian verbs in several ways. They go in pairs, and they have 5 important features. Then you need to take into consideration each time when you use verb of motion. Applying these features is like putting several pieces of puzzles together. Let's look at these features. Feature number 1. You need to decide on type of movement. Is it walking or riding, flying or climbing, crawling or wandering? Is it just moving alone or moving plus taking something or someone with you along the way? Each of those types of movements is described with a pair of verbs of motion. There are a total of 18 of those pairs. Some of these pairs are more common than others, and you need to learn all of them eventually in order to master Russian verbs of motion. Feature number 2, you need to decide on direction of movement. Is it a one-way movement from point A to point B? Is it a round trip? Is it a chaotic movement without any special direction or destination? You choose one or the other verb from a verb of motion pair based upon this feature. The choice is not very obvious. It requires understanding the context in which each kind of verbs of motion is being used. The next feature, feature number 3, is prefixes. Verbs of motion, all 18 pairs, can be used both with and without prefixes. There are a total of 16 prefixes that can be used with verbs of motion. Each prefix adds a certain meaning to the verb, expressing some details about the movement. Is it reaching a destination or just approaching it? Is it crossing or passing by? Is it leaving a place for a short or for a long time? To apply this verbs of motion feature, you need to learn the meaning for all 16 verbs of motion prefixes and pay attention how each prefix changes the meaning of the specific verb of motion. Feature number 4, prepositions that are used with verbs of motion. There are a total of 25 prepositions that are used to describe a route or some other details of a movement. Is it moving in or out, towards or away from, across or along? Some prepositions are confusing. For example, в and на. You need to clearly distinguish one from the other. Is it correct «мы идем в оперу» or «на оперу»? Is it correct «он плавает в море» or «на море»? Is it correct «они едут в машине» or «на машине»? Some prepositions mirror verbs of motion prefixes. They're the same. It's important to know which ones do that. For example, prefix do, preposition do that. Доехать до города. Both types are до, preposition and prefix. Отъехать от города. Preposition and prefix are от. Заехать за детьми. Preposition and prefix are за. But you cannot do the same with под. Подъехать под город is incorrect. All prepositions need to be coordinated with the cases. You need to know which prepositions are used with which cases. Some prepositions can be used with more than one case, and they express different meaning with each case in those situations. For example, preposition за can be used with accusative and with instrumental. When it is used with accusative, the meaning is behind. Заехать за дом, to drive behind the house. When it is used with preposition with the instrumental case, the meaning is to pick up. Заехать за детьми, to pick up children. Feature number 5. Cases for the nouns that are used with verbs of motion. As I already said, verbs of motion are not used alone. They always have different types of nouns after them. Nouns, and most often together with prefixes, describe a route or some other detail about a movement. For example, means of transportation, ехать на поезде. Types of roads or stops, ехать по Невскому проспекту. Приехать на станцию. Landmarks, доехать до театра. Lengths of movement, проехать 2 квартала. All nouns are used in different cases, and each case indicates one of those details. You need to go through all of those 5 verbs of motion features step by step when you build any sentence with verb of motion. And that is the number one reason why verbs of motions are so challenging. They are complex verbs by their grammatical nature. Unfortunately, all those verbs of motion features are rarely explained in Russian courses clearly enough and in steps. That makes learning Russian verbs of motion even harder for any student. And this is the number 2 reason why verbs of motion are so challenging. Their complex nature is very rarely explained in a way that is easy to understand. Also, in order to master verbs of motion, you need not only understand how those verbs of motion features need to be applied, but also develop the skills to use those complex features in your spontaneous speech. How to develop these skills? Through practice. That is organized in a very focused way, in isolation from other skills, and in steps from simple to complex choices of verbs of motion features. If you don't have your practice organized in this step-by-step way, you'll have a mess in your head. And verbs of motion practice is very rarely organized in this way in Russian courses. This is the number 3 reason why verbs of motions are so challenging. Incorrectly organized practice. And reason number 4 why verbs of motion are so challenging is the last but not least. Verbs of motion have a lot of irregularities in their forms. And they're challenging because their irregular forms require a lot of memorization. In my Russian verbs of motion program, I cover all of those verbs of motion challenges for you. First, you will learn this challenging group of verbs separately in isolation from other grammar or conversational topics, so you can focus your full attention on it. Second, all lessons are built in the way that you learn the verbs of motion concept and system step by step, one feature at a time. So it will be clear and easy for you to understand how they work. The third, all practice is also organized in steps, from simple to more complex choices. From memorizing all forms, including irregular ones, to recognizing and understanding verbs of motion selection. From first applying one verb of motion feature to gradually combining several and then all their features together. So you can put all the pieces of puzzles together and develop your skills using verb of motion comfortably and solidly. As a result, you won't have any other choice but master Russian verbs of motion once and for all.